good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're joining us from. We really are appreciative that you've decided to come learn with us as part of our first webinar series here at Regrow, Climate Action Through Agriculture. I'm Kate Hayes, I'm Director of Communications here at Regrow, and so I'll be moderating today's session about the science behind soil carbon and carbon markets. So when we talk about soil carbon, we're doing it in the context of measuring the environmental impact of farming. Right now, the food and ag sector contributes about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, which I'm sure you're aware of. Up to 40% of the Earth's land and soil is degraded, and many regions around the world are struggling with biodiversity loss and also depletion of freshwater resources. On top of all that, of course, the big thing, we're all dealing with the effects of climate change. We know what's ahead if we don't find a way to fix this problem. So there's an urgent need to limit global warming by reducing emissions as quickly as possible. At Regrow, we believe, along with many others, that agriculture has the potential to be a big part of the climate change solution. Of course, cutting direct emissions is the first line of action. But in addition to that, soil carbon presents another opportunity to take climate action through agriculture. Soil is a key component of the global carbon cycle, and taking better care of it can help us restore the balance of this life cycle to sequester more carbon in the ground and enable farmers to not just mitigate climate change, but also adapt and build resilience, which is just as important for ensuring their future profitability and productivity as it is to ensuring global food security, making sure we all still have enough to eat. So now more than ever, there's momentum from corporations, climate action regulators, and food producers to start to adopt and scale regenerative farming practices that really focus on restoring soil health. For food companies, the bulk of their indirect or scope 3 emissions really comes from the farms that supply their ingredients. So they are looking for ways to support and incentivize the farmers they work with to adopt those sustainable practices. But even outside the food and ag industry, there are third-party carbon project developers that are buying carbon credits from farmers and then selling them to other companies outside the sector that still need ways to reduce or offset emissions from their supply chains. So that's, voluntary carbon markets. But all of that hinges on the ability to understand and accurately measure soil carbon, a topic that continues to be debated. So that is what we're here to talk about today. We're going to spend the first part of this webinar covering some of the topics we've already outlined, but we also want to save a good portion to answer some of the questions that we have received from participants in advance. You may also have a question you haven't yet submitted, so please feel free to type that into the chat. We may not be able to get to all of the questions during the session, but we'll get to as many as we can, and then we'll try to follow up with you on others to the extent that we can. So we are joined by 3 great experts to help us learn more about soil carbon from a variety of perspectives. I'm going to check in with Betsy here to see, are we able to get everyone on video?
We're still looking into it, but I think we should just roll with it for now.
Okay.
Thanks,
well,
Kate.
You can't see their beautiful faces, but hopefully you will shortly. We have Dr. Bill Salas. He's our Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of Regrow. Bill's going to help us understand the science behind soil carbon measurement and modeling. Lots of questions about science. So we have Bill for that. We also have Dr. Steve Rozensweig, who is the Agriculture Science Lead at General Mills, leading producer of packaged consumer goods, foods, and more than 100 food brands. Steve's also a soil scientist, but he's also going to talk about how General Mills is thinking about regenerative agriculture as an opportunity to reduce emissions within their ag supply chain. And we have Karen Haugen-Kozyra, president of Viresco Solutions. They are leading consultants in low carbon and sustainable agriculture based in Canada. And we're going to get Karen's insights on how she works with companies to develop their climate strategies and advise them on carbon market standards and opportunities. So to start things off, I'd like to give each of them a chance to tell us a little bit more about their background and what they do. especially as it pertains to soil carbon and the broader topic of creating more sustainable food system. So, Bill, we're going to go ahead and start with you. I know you have more than 30 years of experience as a soil scientist in both academia and industry. So could you give us just a little overview of what it is that you do?
Yes, thank you, Kate. And thanks to my co-panelists for joining this discussion today. I thought I'd maybe set the stage in terms of what I do at Regrow now, based on sort of my career journey. So I actually started off in research working at NASA, working on a planetary program. Actually, we sent up a satellite to Venus to understand how the Venus atmosphere is currently as an indicator of potential catastrophic climate change. So I learned remote sensing and carbon modeling through that initial work looking at the planetary program, but then was very fortunate to work in academia at the University of New Hampshire with a dear colleague of mine, Chung-Chun Lee, who was a soil biogeochemical modeler, who taught me a lot about how to model the processes that drive carbon and nitrogen cycling in soils, whether they be agricultural soils or natural soils or wetlands. And got involved in carbon modeling fairly early on in that research, and used the DNDC model, which was developed by Dr. Lee, to really look at sort of the first principles of what drives greenhouse gas emissions and carbon dynamics in soils. So based on that experience, my role at Regrow now is really to spend time and work with our science and engineering teams to not only implement the existing modeling tools that we have, whether they be the soil carbon models, remote sensing tools, but also to keep an eye on where the research is going. Scientific improvements in soil science are continuing to evolve. We need to continue to improve and evolve these models for understanding how agronomic practices influence soil carbon and soil carbon sequestration. So really the role of tools from our perspective is really enabling markets that can reduce transaction costs, because we need to be able to engage with farmers and ranchers in this endeavor to really create value for them, to then create value all along the value chain. So my role at Regrow is really sort of working with our science and engineering teams to implement current state of the science and continue to improve tools over time.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill. And Steve, you are also a soil scientist by training. So tell us how that prepared you for your current role at General Mills.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everyone for having me here on this panel. I started my soil science journey actually conducting research in grassland restoration in Kansas. So looking at how much carbon is sequestered in soil when agricultural land is restored back to the tall grass prairie ecosystem there. And I found that in 35 years of restoration, the soil carbon was over 50% higher than the agricultural field. And all these other researchers that were out there were finding that the grassland restoration was also leading to cleaner water and supporting spider and bird biodiversity and all these great benefits. So that got me really excited. And so I decided to get my PhD in soil science from Colorado State to see, to what extent can dryland farmers in Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska are they able to achieve these kinds of impacts while still producing food? And so what I found is that, not only are their farmers sequestering carbon in a very dry environment, but they're also growing more total grain with the same amount of fertilizer and cutting a majority of their herbicide inputs. And that led them to have systems that were more, profitable than their conventional neighbors. And so, that led me to wonder, why wasn't everybody doing this if these systems were more profitable and better for the environment? And so I decided to add a human dimension to my research and, build a kind of a soil science background to really look at all of these other barriers that are preventing farmers from doing these things, like social pressures and risk tolerance and prohibitive policies. And so now at General Mills, I'm responsible for creating strategies that will help farmers in our sourcing regions overcome these barriers to transitioning to regenerative systems, as well as setting up the monitoring systems to track the environmental and economic impacts of those transitions. So that's kind of what led me to what I'm doing now. Oh, and I see my video works. Hi, everyone.
Hey, there's Steve. That is a really interesting path, and I can't wait to learn more about what you're working on there when it comes to carbon and regenerative agriculture. But now let's go to Karen. Karen, I know you have a wealth of experience in agricultural greenhouse gas measurement and modeling, and I also know that you've developed climate change and environment policy within the Canadian government. So now you've shifted into consulting, and I wonder what made you decide to go into that aspect of the business. Let's see if I can unmute Karen.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. And I don't know if my video is going to work if Stevens is on. Oh, there I am. Okay. And can I share my screen? Would that be okay? I see I can do it. Awesome. All right. So yeah, I mean, I cut my teeth in one of the oldest carbon markets. It's been around since 2015. It's the Alberta carbon pricing system. So we've had 2007. We've had 15 years of developing offsets that work on the ground. So I started off in compliance carbon offsets markets, worked at the federal level, and then started to get more engaged in the voluntary carbon offset markets because I saw a lot of challenges there with getting it right for agriculture. Globally, there's been a market failure, I would say, for agricultural carbon offsets and methodologies. And in recent years, we have seen some innovation happening in the voluntary carbon market space through the two new protocols that Regrow and I think Stephen, you've got your eye on the Soil Enrichment Project Protocol and the Improved Ag Land Management Protocol through Vera. But these are really challenging to do, and the corporates are facing some pretty existential pressures in terms of setting science-based targets with high expectations now moving to net zero. And civil society setting those out. General Mills is no exception. They're feeling that pressure. And so as we take a look at how things have grown in demand for financial services and nature-based solutions, the things we're talking about today are very, very sought after, highly desired in the marketplace. And then the types of companies that are setting these net zero commitments, and there's many, many of them. Food and beverage processing is driving a lot of the interest on the ground in farming, to some degree, textiles, apparels, cotton and things, and then retailing, some of our retail companies as well, in the McDonald's space, for example, with their science-based targets. So we see this overwhelming commitment by corporates to move forward to net zero. At the same time, in the voluntary carbon market, there's these integrity initiatives that have been consulting, and the idea of standardizing what the terms are that's, define a high quality carbon credit. All of this is in development and shifting sands, if you will. I often say it's like standing on a bowl full of Jell-O. So the corporates really need a lot of assistance in understanding how to access these marketplaces, when to access them, what are the right pathways to take on their journey to net zero. And we can talk about that more. So a lot of developing stuff, a lot of challenges for corporates out there. And agriculture, as I said, if we just take a look at globally, what has been the issuances to date, it's not even appearing as a blip. Agriculture is this burgundy bar that doesn't show up. There is some 0.2%, mostly the avoided grasslands conversion, which Stephen was talking about earlier. We've had some success with those protocols in the US, but by and large, it hasn't been working well for agriculture, and we can talk more about why.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. Can you hear? Can you see? Okay, there we go. Here I am on camera. Thank you, Karen. That was really helpful. It was nice to have the slides to help us understand what you're telling us there. And now I think we want to dive a little bit back into the science aspect. Let's kind of start at ground zero. And Bill, I'm hoping that you can help us get a better understanding of soil carbon. Like, what is it? How do we measure it? People say it's not possible. Why? When I know that's exactly what you do. So can you explain some of the science to us?
Sure, happy to. Thank you, Kate. No, so as we sort of set the stage for this, there's significant and heightened interest in how to sequester organic carbon in soils, agricultural soils, in the context of today's discussion, and effectively lead to removals of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And this is coming from stronger and stronger interest and commitments by corporates that are setting science-based targets and ambitious net zero goals. So, to get to net zero, clearly we need to be able to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And while that's not the focus of this discussion, we just want to remind the audience that journey toward net zero requires both removals and greenhouse gas mitigation. And I think another reason there's strong interest in this topic, especially in the ag sector, is the co-benefits that come along with soil carbon sequestration. Agriculture is at the heart of climate change. It's impacted significantly with changing weather patterns. And so one of the co-benefits of soil carbon sequestration is improved resilience of agricultural production systems, as well as other environmental benefits, such as improvements in water quality, biodiversity, increased nutrient cycling. So there's really a strong interest in how to achieve soil carbon sequestration and enhance soil carbon stocks in agricultural soils. So how do we do that? If you just take a sort of a high level picture of it, organic carbon in the soil is driven by organic matter. What's soil organic matter? It's basically all that organic matter that was living material, whether it was plants, microbes, dead microbes. They compose the soil organic matter stocks, and soil organic carbon is the carbon component of those soil organic matter stocks. So how do we change soil carbon stocks over time? It's basically they're in a continuous dynamic equilibrium where we're losing soil carbon through respiration, but we're adding new soil carbon through mineralization of organic matter and creation of biomass in the soil and organic carbon. So it's this balance between carbon inputs from photosynthesis and organic carbon losses through respiration. And so when we think about agricultural systems, management affects both the loss and accretion of carbon in the soil. So you understand, how agronomic practices can enhance productivity, increase photosynthesis, production of organic matter, and then also tillage or soil disturbance can increase rates of carbon loss from the soils. So it's really this balance between carbon inputs and carbon losses in the soil. Traditionally, soil carbon stocks have been estimated by direct measurement. You go out, you pull a core, you take the soils to a lab, you do dry combustion to understand both the percent carbon in the soils, and then you do a bulk density measurement so you can estimate soil carbon stocks to a prescribed depth, whether it's 30 centimeters or 50 centimeters, depending on the system. So these are highly accurate approaches, but they're really expensive to go out and measure and pull hundreds of cores to get a good understanding of soil carbon stocks. So what we need to think about is, how can we combine these traditional soil carbon measurement approaches, pulling cores, sending them to a lab, with more innovative technological solutions that are being developed now. So what we're seeing is there's a creation of new technologies that are using in situ sensors to actually spatially measure in the field an estimate of both percent soil carbon and using penetrometers to estimate soil bulk density, because you need to measure both to get your full carbon stocks. These are very promising technologies. There's a lot of investment going in this space. And I think, over time, they will continue to improve, but recognizing that they still require good calibration and validation with actual high quality lab measurements. Another innovation I think will help in this space is how do we develop effective soil carbon sampling schemes? Where do you sample within a field to get an understanding of soil carbon stocks at time, at the beginning of a program, and then if you're going to remeasure 5 or 10 years down the road? And that's where remote sensing tools can really track the spatial patterns of the drivers that influence soil carbon within the field. So I think we're seeing in the industry significant innovations in this space, a combination of in situ sensors, more efficient lab measurement techniques, remote sensing to develop sampling strategies that are cost effective. Lastly, I'll touch on it here, but I'll get back to it a bit more, is the role of process or mechanistic models that can take these in situ measurements, extrapolate the measurements in space and time so we can track the impacts of agronomic practices on soil carbon stock changes over space and time. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later in the webinar. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Bill. See if I can get, Betsy might make me come up on camera. So if not, you can hear me. Steve, I wanted to talk to you more about what it is that you're working on at General Mills. I think it's really fascinating that that you guys are exploring regen ag the way you are. So tell us about the current projects that you're looking into, and maybe give us a sense of how food companies can start to tap into this opportunity to reduce emissions in their supply chain.
Yeah, sure. So we have a goal registered with the Science Based Target Initiative. We were actually the first company back in 2015 to have a goal that covers our full Scope 3 value chain. So that's everything from farm to fork to landfill. And so, we have a 42% reduction of our Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030, and a 30% reduction of our Scope 3 emissions, and a net zero by 2050 commitment. So we've been at this now for quite a while, and we also set a goal to advance regenerative ag on 1 million acres by 2030 back in 2019. And so, we've already been successful in hitting the levels of reduction for our Scope 1 and 2 emissions through investments in things like renewable energy and efficiency in our operations. But really Scope 3 emissions and those emissions in the agricultural value chain really do make up the bulk of our emissions, and so that's where most of the work is to be done. And so regenerative agriculture is one of our key strategies for reducing that. And so we define regenerative ag as a holistic approach that's based on 6 universal principles for repairing and enhancing ecosystem function, including keeping the soil covered, keeping a living root in the ground as long as possible throughout the year, minimizing chronic physical and chemical disturbances to the ecosystem, maximizing diversity, integrating livestock, and doing that all within the unique context of each farm and ranch. So it's not just a universal checklist of practices that can be applied everywhere and have this regenerative effect. It's a really adaptive, principles-based approach that has to be really figured out in each of these unique contexts. So our approach so far has been to one, really get a better understanding of what our agricultural emissions even are. And so that's really led us to Regrow to use satellite imagery to better understand what agricultural practices farmers are using in our key sourcing regions, and then to model what those greenhouse gas impacts are. So that's the first step, is really to get a better sense of what our emissions are. The second is to really form collaborations and coalitions to invest in locally led approaches to accelerating regenerative ag adoption. No one company is going to be able to have these kinds of landscape scale impacts that we really need to achieve, the planetary goal of, minimizing warming, keeping it below 1.5 degrees C. We really need to work collaboratively and have these locally led approaches. And then the third piece has really been to help build, the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, or ESMC, which is a nonprofit ecosystem service market designed specifically for Scope 3. And so that's kind of how I think about our strategy at a high level. And then, to the question of like how a food company can get started on this path, I think, first is to set a target, work with the Science Based Targets Initiative to set a target, and conduct an inventory to understand what your emissions are. And then, when you're getting to your Scope 3 agricultural emissions, I'd say try to find where there's already these collaborative spaces where groups are co-creating and enabling local action at a specific landscape scale, where you source. Too often I think companies are creating these strategies without an understanding of that local context, and they end up taking an extractive approach. It's really just they're going to farmers and partners on the ground saying, "Get me carbon. I need this. How do you deliver that to me?" And that's not going to work. And what we've seen is it's just caused this huge proliferation of programs and approaches out there on the ground that, are causing farmers and implementation partners to get overwhelmed. It's just so many different programs that they have to learn and understand and figure out how to implement. And so it's just causing a lot of them to just throw up their hands and, kind of stay out of it. So we need a lot more collaboration and alignment across the industry, really in this place-based landscape scale approach. And so that's really where I think we need to do more work. But for a company getting started, I'd say, figure out where those landscapes are that you source from and kind of get plugged into work that's already underway.
So from your point of view, do companies have the option to stay out of it, knowing what we know about the future?
No, definitely not. And, the reality is that we need everyone who has an agricultural footprint to get involved. So, a lot of times there's heavy scrutiny placed on very public facing food brands, but the reality is, only a small fraction of the agricultural landscape is producing human food. So, it's not going to be enough if like General Mills, if we only work on our individual company supply chain. That would work if everyone had a goal, but only a fraction of the industry actually has goals to begin with. So the companies who are in this now, we need to punch way above our weight to have the kind of landscape scale impact that the planet requires. And we also need to make sure that everybody, food companies and agribusinesses, but also governments in the public sector are held accountable for reducing emissions, at that jurisdictional level. Because no one group or company is going to be able to do this on their own.
Yeah. So Karen, I'm hoping maybe you can help us understand more about the difference between, what Steve's doing at General Mills. What's the difference between the insetting work and the offset markets that other types of companies might be interested in?
Yeah. Can you see my screen, Kate?
Yep.
Okay, so we talked about these two decarbonization pathways and the fact that with net zero and commitments to science-based targets, that companies are going to need to get into both of these markets to meet their commitments. So Steve's been talking a lot about the scope 3 inventories and the science-based targets. And that is where the carbon intensity through interventions is calculated and flows along the supply chain with that carbon crop, and it's captured in inventories of companies as they are transforming it along the value chain. And then an offsetting, which is a standalone carbon as a commodity, right? These markets were created for carbon. Here, it's the traditional agricultural good markets that these lower carbon intensity commodities that companies like Steven has affected. So really, they're going to need both. They're going to have to be able to balance their emissions they can't avoid and mitigate and reduce by going out into the offset market for either carbon neutral claims or net zero claims beyond value chain. And this can be a really important pathway for climate. The airlines, it's another marketplace. But for this side, where Stephen was talking about, this is really now doing as much effort as you can within your value chain. 70% of the footprint is upstream on farm for food and beverage companies. And they need to figure out how to collectively, through partnerships, intervene and help farmers and ranchers to be able to reduce the carbon intensity of what they're generating from the land. But it's challenging to do this. Otherwise, we would have tons of offsets in the voluntary carbon market. So when we think about trying to do this, in the agricultural space, you wind up, of course, they're not metered, so it's a biological system. So that introduces risk and cost. We can rely on modeling and estimates and the new generation protocols that have come out, the innovations Bill was talking about, and how Regrow is positioned to actually take advantage of that. It's good, it's allowed, but there's always risk and uncertainty. So you wind up with deductions of the value per acre. And then each smart farm, each unit has a small amount of carbon. It needs to be aggregated to scale in a monitoring, measuring, reporting, and verification tracking system that Stephen referred to. And again, the revenue stream is small for each farm. I noticed some of the comments about, well, if it's, so much per acre, does that make sense for me to engage now? So against that uncertainty that Stephen was talking about, different programs and different prices and different everything, it's like, should I now or should I keep my powder dry? And then there's always the tricky things that are difficult for a person who has 40 years of seasons to grow a crop to understand that I have to keep that soil organic carbon sequestered for 100 plus years. That's the agreement on these fungible commodities in a carbon market. There is some risk that activities can shift outside the project where you're doing things. And so that has to be taken account. And then additionality is always a tough one in the offset markets, because additionality in its purest form is, well, if that carbon market or that price on carbon did not exist, then the project wouldn't make sense doing it. And in agriculture, it's always a small little stream of the carbon offset through improvements in efficiency and operational management. So those are the challenges that we have. The good news is we've learned a lot. I come from Alberta, where we have 18 megatons of CO2e that was generated under our conservation cropping protocol in our compliance-based market. We understand these things. We're on the next generation of protocols. We're getting ways and mechanisms to do this. It doesn't fall on the farmer. It's at the company level. There are those scientific challenges that Bill, but we're getting there. There's innovation happening in the space, and some technical challenges, as Bill had mentioned, about sampling. And so as we look at the myriad of different types of quantification approaches, I think we need more standardization in the space. There's the good, the not so good, but the innovation is going to take us with these new soil enrichment project protocols and the improved ag land management under Vera into some new, opportunities for agriculture. And we continue to work on this. So working a lot in the voluntary carbon market space, we take a look at the work, a first time protocol out the gate rarely works. If I was going to give advice to anybody, watch what's happening with a protocol. When was it developed? What's happening? Is it getting revised? You can take a look at the number of issued offsets in agriculture. We have some excitement happening here with the soil enrichment project protocol, and look at the interest in the verified improved agricultural land management. And I think Climate Neutral Group in South Africa will have the first issued tons. So these are early days in the market, but I see so much investment happening. It's very, very encouraging. So I'm going to leave it there.
Well, thanks, Karen. And I'm looking through the questions. We're getting quite a few. There's one that just pertains to what you've been talking about. Someone would like to learn more about additionality. If there's anything else you can say. She says, I work with growers who've been using regenerative ag for years and would like to register carbon credits in viticulture, either to sell or for their own neutrality.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, those two new protocols that whether you're doing an offset or an inset, because they can be a blueprint to put into your supply chain quantification, monitoring, reporting, and verification system, they have unique approaches, finally recognizing that farmers are not going to stop completely about the way they're growing crops. They're always layering on new practices and new innovation. So additionality is defined differently in those two new next-gen protocols, more favorably for agriculture. Then on the scope 3 side, it's not additionality, it's causality. Doesn't matter what the uptake has been of that practice in a region. If it is new, if it has been financed, if it's interventions of multiple corporates coming together to help share in the risk and reward, that's new to the farm, that's causality. So additionality doesn't apply in scope 3, which is kind of nice, but there's innovation happening all the time in this space.
Great. This is a question I'm thinking any of you can answer, and Steve, it actually even brings to mind, there was a photo that you had prepared to share, but it's, how does water quality impact soil health or carbon footprint? Is water quality on your radar? And I even wonder if you flip-flop that, how does soil health impact water quality? But would you like to shed a little light on that for us?
Yeah, sure. And so, to us, regenerative agriculture, a key goal of that is to repair and enhance ecosystem function. And so, farms work as an ecosystem just like forests and grasslands do. There's these important processes at work, like the water cycle, the nutrient cycle, pest dynamics. And so you can put that picture up, so, this picture is showing, on one side of the field, that's a broken water cycle, right? That field can't infiltrate the rain that's falling. And so that soil is not able to infiltrate water or absorb that water. And so that water is running off into the ditch and into streams and waterways and taking with it all of the soil and nutrients and chemicals that were applied to the field. So that's a situation that's not great for the farmer because they can't use any of that water. And I know, this is a region, this is actually a picture from Oklahoma, that's a water limited environment. So that farmer can't use their most precious resource, which is that rainwater, to grow a crop. So it's not good for the farmer economically. And then it's also bad for the water quality as well. And so, this kind of gets back to, what is our real goal in agriculture? And I get why many people say that we should not solely rely on soil carbon to mitigate climate change. And I agree with that. There's lots of other things that we need to be doing to mitigate climate change. But when it comes to agricultural management, I think that we really need to be oriented towards this systems level regeneration, because not only can it help sequester some carbon, which has a benefit for the climate, but it also helps to reduce fertilizer losses, by repairing and enhancing the nutrient cycle. It can help farmers build resilience to these kinds of extremes and actually help support, the overall resilience of the food and agricultural system, which is a big reason why we invest in it. And so, I think we have to be oriented towards these kinds of systems level solutions, because it's really the root cause of a lot of our issues related to water. And biodiversity is kind of some of this, broken ecosystem processes. And so we need to kind of address that root cause first, which has all of these connected benefits to water and farmer economics and climate. And so I think that's just an important framing to have in our head, because, otherwise we sort of just go right towards emissions reducing technologies, which are very important to be, weaving into this system. But unless you're really addressing the root causes of kind of ecosystem dysfunction, for example, we can't just write the farmer on the left a greenhouse gas mitigation strategy, apply some different technologies to that field. There's some more fundamental issues there. So I think, having first that systems level orientation is really critical, and it helps address all of these other issues too.
That is really, really helpful to know. And Bill, I'm getting a lot of questions more specifically about modeling. And so I'm going to ask a couple. I think there's some that are a little bit repetitive, but do you think soil sampling must be replaced by modeling in order to estimate soil organic carbon?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a role for all technologies in this space. If we just take a step back, we're only going to create these removals at scale if it works economically for the growers and the ranchers that are producing these products that are being sourced. So we need to find a cost-effective approach for quantifying not just carbon stocks, but actually changes in carbon stocks over time, because that's the currency at which we're creating these markets. So measurements are critical. The measurements have been very informative for improving our understanding of the processes of soil carbon turnover and to develop process or mechanistic models. So I think in the end, there will be a balance between targeted measurements using in situ measurements, a combination of traditional soil carbon cores and lab analysis, as well as in situ sensors, proximal sensors that will estimate soil carbon stocks. But in the end, I think we need process models for a few reasons. One, to extrapolate over large acres, over millions of acres. If you think about the commitments on regenerative ag, we're talking about millions of acres. So it'd be cost prohibitive to go out and measure soil carbon stocks, as well as measure the full greenhouse gas outcomes, right? Because soil carbon is an important driver, but it influences greenhouse gas emissions. It influences N2O, which is very expensive. So I think the role of process models are be able to simulate stock changes over annual time steps, quantify the full greenhouse gas accounting, and even more importantly, the counterfactual, right? These markets are creating benefits of what would have happened had you not implemented that practice change. So you could either set aside part of your field if you're measuring, but that's taking your field out of that production system. So you need tools that can model and simulate that counterfactual. So that's where process models are really very powerful. Now, models are models. They're far from perfect. So we need well-targeted measurements to quantify and validate these modeling tools. So when the model gives us a number, we know, what does that mean? What's the uncertainty of that estimate? And I think from a market perspective, because modeling, soil carbon stock changes at a subfield scale is really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so we're seeing that the models sometimes overestimate, underestimate. But I think the question we're answering with the model uncertainty is, what's the impact of the program on the total carbon benefits? And so in that case, we tend to get much better performance from the models at the program scale. And there's policy that have been set from various compliance perspectives, like the California Air Resources Board, that the uncertainty should be quantified at the program scale or at the project scale, so not at the subfield scale. That said, soil carbon stock science is evolving. There's new sort of approaches to thinking about how There's different organic matter pools in the soil that are associated with particulates or mineral associated particulate matter that influences the rate of turnover, and the models are evolving to capture that new science. So I do think, we have to rely on well-targeted measurements of soil carbon stocks, but process models are a key tool to help scale these programs and enable benefits for farmers, because in the end, this has to be a return on investment from the farmer's perspective. And models are a cost-effective way of doing this at scale, as long as we statistically validate the tools, report uncertainty. The market will bear that uncertainty. The market will know how to consume it.
Okay. And I do have a follow-up question too about remote sensing, and I know you talked about that earlier, but how valuable is it in soil carbon monitoring, and specifically how often should those measurements then be taken? Monthly, weekly?
So I think remote sensing is a very powerful tool for understanding the surface patterns of soil characteristics, including organic matter. As get more organic matter in the soils become darker. That's a spectral signature that remote sensing can actually map. So very valuable for understanding variability in stocks. Soil carbon stock changes. While soil carbon is highly dynamic, the percent change each year is quite small compared to the total stocks. So remote sensing is more of an inventory tool for understanding the landscape variability of soil carbon. And then we use that data to drive the models to estimate annual changes, because the fidelity of remote sensing estimates of surface soil carbon can't distinguish annual changes. So there's no reason to sort of remeasure at that sort of time scale. Now, temporal dynamics in this remote sensing signal gives us an indication of soil characteristics that is used then to drive the sampling strategy. So we're not trying to measure directly the soil carbon stock changes at those short time periods, but giving us an indication of different soil characteristics that we then sample against for doing the measurements to then drive the process models.
Okay. Steve, we have a question specifically for you. How much visibility does General Mills have into its supply shed? Do you know exactly which farms you're sourcing from?
In most cases, we don't. And so especially for crops like wheat, which are our biggest ingredient, we're often buying flour from a mill who's sourcing that wheat from a grain terminal, which is sourcing it from many, many country elevators out there in the landscape. And that sourcing will shift year to year based on we have to hit certain specs for our qualities, things like protein, for example, and that kind of is determined by the weather in a lot of cases. And so our sourcing sort of shifts around within a particular region. And that's why we take the approach of a supply shed, where we draw a boundary around the region that we know our grain is coming from. And then we are trying to influence that whole region, really try to advance regenerative ag and these other greenhouse gas reducing technologies within that whole place. And it especially helps that we have, our regenerative ag commitment that's also oriented towards seeing improvements in biodiversity and water, because those things also operate at the landscape scale. And so, I think that kind of region, that orientation to the whole region really is the way to go for us, and the complexity of our supply chain, but also just kind of the higher level landscape goals that we're oriented to.
Very interesting. Karen, I'm going to ask this one to you. It says, how are the speakers thinking about the sale of carbon insets like through ESMC versus taking a supply shed approach where multiple companies can claim the same, or could claim the same shared emissions reduction in their SBTI scope 3 emissions tracking, and which is more strategic today for food and ag companies or retailers?
So I think the question is that mostly around scope 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you do not have a carbon commodity in scope 3. You have intervened, and I think the whole thing is designed to have multiple companies intervene in their supply shed for interventions in a collective action project, right? Getting around the causality, which, is more favorable to making more change happen on the landscape. And the allocation of those benefits from the co-investment and the attribution of those benefits through credible claims is being set up in the value change initiative that many of us are working on in the Third Ag Working Group. So we're mapping out the credible allocation and the credible attribution and a system that can track that, almost like a registry in the carbon offset world. And so the level of investment is decided between companies, and we're working with several that are coming together, some of them an input supplier, others just purchasing goods and services from the farm, and being able to amplify the amount of value that goes back on a per acre basis, which is something you can't do in an offset market. The seller and the buyer come to agreement. Often it's a bilateral trade-off line, and you live with the price. Whereas the collaborative effort, where the double counting doesn't apply, because as Stephen was pointing out, sometimes the activity was within one company's corporate according to the volume of the good they buy from the farm. Another company might want another crop that's impacted coming from that farm. So the opportunity for multiple investment, the opportunity to get beyond, a small price of carbon today that we see in the voluntary offset market. And it's not a commodity. It is an agreement that is made between the corporates who are working at the supply shed level, co-investing to make things happen at scale on the landscape.
I think there is an important trade-off here too, that's kind of reflected in the question, because what we're seeing is that it's not enough just to bring demand through a carbon inset market, for example. We have to also be investing to create supply. And so there's, for example, in our ESMC roadmap, we'd love to just be able to bring as much investment straight to the farmer as possible, but there's so much stuff that has to get set up first. The farmers need, in order to be successful in actually generating credit in these markets, a farmer needs to have the understanding of how to do that. They need support from a technical, assistant, advisor to help them figure out which practices, which combination of things are going to be profitable and right for their business, as well as, deliver these ecosystem outcomes. They need a supportive social environment. They need someone to help them enter data into these management platforms and keep records. So true. And so there's all of these fixed costs and capacity building and all these other things that have to happen. And so, that's all stuff we are investing in, as well as sending a demand signal for just the credit at the back end. And I think that's something that it'd be great for a lot of other companies to help co-invest in those fixed costs for actually, enabling farmer success in these markets, because I think a lot of companies are just waiting until these markets are fully developed and the protocols are all figured out. And the reality is there's not going to be any demand unless we're investing now to help farmers be able to create supply. So
yeah,
that's why I think that collaborative supply shed investment is critical.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
This is the partnership model, right? And if you're doing offsets, it's still going to take partnerships. It's going to take boots on the ground, farm information management systems, agronomists working with growers, all the investment that General Mills is doing, and other companies like General Mills to pull this off. And it's partnership based. When you get into because this is a generic data flow, data management system, we can see Regrow here and Regrow here. But to pull this off in an offset market is one thing. To pull it off in a scope 3, where you're going to have more partners, it really is all about partnerships if we want to do this at scale. Thanks,
so
Steve.
Can you tell us, where does a company even begin if they haven't started down this path? Because I can see that it could easily be overwhelming and you just don't even, where do you start?
I mean, I think it's a barrier that goes bigger than just kind of knowing where to start if you're a company. I think there, it's the guidance is extremely complicated and constantly evolving. And so you need, someone you need an expert essentially at every company to help interpret this guidance and understand where it's going, even to create a strategy. And then, like we've shared here, it's just, there's so much that it takes to be involved and set up these things. There's no easy button just to kind of throw your dollars in a bucket and then it gets, it gets put to work. And I think that's ultimately kind of what we need to work towards. There's all sorts of work happening globally around things like jurisdictional approaches, especially to things like tropical rainforest deforestation, jurisdictional approaches where the governments are held accountable And private sector is really helping enable this collective goal that's really owned and championed by the public sector. You know, we don't really have anything like that, at least in our kind of North American commodity supply chains. And I think we need to move towards some models like that, where it's more of a you're more responsible for a financial contribution to a shared collective goal, as opposed to having, you know, every company has their own individual commitment, and we have to trace every dollar to every ton of carbon impacted, to every crop, to each company. It's just so much complexity that it is really hard for companies to jump in. And I think that's kind of the problem that we have to figure out is, yeah, how do we get away from this extreme allocation as a huge barrier? Because otherwise, yeah, it's not going to work.
Yeah, Kate, I think you're getting some insights into some discussions we had during New York Climate Week, where we were all together. And if we could think of a pre-competitive way to establish monitoring systems, you know, so that not every company has to establish its monitoring systems to meet the WIGHGP land sector's removals guidance, like collaboration. And Stephen, I think to some extent, the climate smart commodity funding that is rolled out, and more will roll out, in a way that is the public sector and saying, yes, we want to get these things going. Let's set up the systems. Let's understand what it takes to get carbon and lower carbon intensity products off the land, right? Commodities off the land.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think what that's doing is investing in creating like dozens of different approaches for doing this, when, you know, I'm a little worried that it's not all aligned to, you know, even some of our basic requirements, like it has to follow the greenhouse gas protocol guidance. You know, that is not something that is on the radar of the USDA when they're funding different climate smart commodity markets. And so we have lots of things popping up. Some of them are just going to be a flash in the pan because they don't actually connect the supply, whatever they're creating in the market, to the demand, which is like what we are bringing for
Demand drivers. Yeah.
You know, we have to meet certain international standards for how we claim these kinds of reductions. And so there's just some core missing pieces, I think, when we're making these huge investments in climate smart commodity markets, that we're not aligning supply creation with the demand signal. That's something we have to fix.
Agreed.
So in the meantime, Karen, how do you advise companies until all of this is a little bit more cohesive? Like, what do they need to be looking for in their get started partner?
Yeah, well, I mean, their get started partner, there's many partners, but to build out a robust measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification system that can live up to an offset third-party verification or a certification through an entity like Sustain Cert, and Vera is starting its own Scope 3 program. 2 of my staff are over at Vera now to do that. You know, being able to really understand the mechanics of the protocol, the blueprint that you're going to be using to build out the data collection system and the evidence that you need to collect to support interventions on the ground, working with a trusted quantification partner. There's a few now that have got their platforms validated under CARCEP, like Regrow, Indigo. Others are starting. So you know that it's met the requirements and criteria of the, you know, the entity with the protocol and methodology, and keeping an eye on who's doing what on those registries to see how well those projects are moving forward. Some of them are stalled and there has to be more iterations and improvements in protocols. Vera's coming out with version 2, hopefully before Christmas, of the improved ag land management protocol. And then really starting to understand how you could fill gaps in your implementation program and who are those entities that will help you fill those gaps, whether it's financial, whether it's, you know, another advisor on how do we meet the requirements of the new land sector removals guidance? How do we make that? And these things are under development. And so tracking it, Stephen, Bill, and I are on the you know, providing input. We're piloting with other companies on that land sector removals guidance and trying to bring the experience of where agriculture is at in its quantification and in the development of the market and being able to meet those requirements so that there can be some realities interjected into this guidance that's forming.
Okay. Well, we are getting close to time, and I would just like to give each of you the chance to kind of answer one last question, kind of summarizing your thoughts on where we are with soil carbon. Is it a valid solution right now? Even though there are still things that need to be answered, is this still a good strategy for helping to address emissions in the ag supply chain? And Bill, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I mean, soil carbon quantification is hard. It's not an easy process. The science is evolving, but I think we think about it from the ag's value chain perspective. The co-benefits of soil carbon sequestration are so immense, as Steve's image outlined. From a farmer's perspective, I think we have to make this work. We can make it work. That we can create value in these. I think there's some policy discussions that need to be addressed, as Karen has outlined, and we'll work through that. But soil carbon, I think, is a central tool for the strategy to get toward net zero. And as corporates set their strategies, they need the tools to both understand their current inventory and use the same tools to then understand what are some opportunities for reaching their targets, to quantify the outcomes, to transparently document their progress against their technology. So we have to rethink that mentality of inventory tools leading to programs, understanding what's agronomically sound, projects that can follow the guidance of the greenhouse gas protocol, and then transparent reporting to create value for all the stakeholders in the value chain. And soil carbon sequestration is an important process and opportunity for ag here.
Thank you. Steve, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, we know that we have to, the new guidance basically says that we have to track any time soil carbon is lost as an emission within agriculture today. And so we have to set up the systems to be able to monitor soil carbon, regardless of whether it's being lost as an emission or being sequestered as a removal. And so yes, we have to be focused on soil carbon because it has a huge impact on what the overall emissions profile of the agricultural system is. And then, like I said before, I think just if we're oriented towards that systems level ecosystem regeneration, for water, for biodiversity, for farmer resilience, then, soil carbon is one of the benefits of that overall process. And so, yes, we should be focused on that as a piece of the overall puzzle, but soil carbon on its own is not going to solve climate change.
I'm not the silver bullet. Karen, final words from you?
Silver buckshot. We've got to throw a bunch of strategies at the wall, and removals are highly sought after. You look at the trends in the marketplace, and removals are trending. Nature-based solutions are twice the value of any other type of commodity instrument that's trading right now. So it's not going to go away. The Integrity Council, the Net Zero Pathways Group, people are needing removals more so as time goes on. And so I see a tremendous interest in making this happen. And I don't know, we're not going away. All of us, we're not going away. We'll keep working on it.
We're going to be following up with an email to share the link to the recording, and just would like to encourage you that if you'd like to learn more, go ahead and visit regrow.ag to do that, or you can follow us on one of our social media channels. We actually have a 3-series blog posts edition on Scope 3 emissions right now, so you can check that out. And we look forward to bringing you more interesting topics in the year ahead. So thank you for joining. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you for the next one.